Welcome, dear friends, as we begin this 20th year of the Turner Winter Series. I'm Maureen Raveno, and I am delighted to offer this welcome on behalf of Greg Peterson, the founder and perennial host of the Turner Winter Series these many years. We welcome with delight those of you who are with us this evening in the comfort of the Kappa Theater, here in the Robert H. Jackson Center, as well as all those who are enjoying this program virtually. It is my great pleasure to begin our evening with a brief introduction of our guest, Rod Beckerink, after which I will turn the conversation over to Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. Rod Beckerink is a lifelong resident of Chautauqua County, having been born and raised here in Clymer, long known for its Dutch heritage and fondly associated with windmills and tulip festivals. Rod left the county to pursue his education elsewhere, however, achieving a Bachelor of Arts degree from Hope College in, appropriately, Holland, Michigan, and also a Master of Arts in History from the University of Toledo in Ohio. Rod has had a lifelong interest in history, which he combined with travel, and out of which he taught social studies at Southwestern High School, from which he is now retired. His community contributions include serving as president of the Clymer Historical Society and as vice president of the Southern Chautauqua Federal Credit Union. He resides happily in Jamestown with his wife, Marion, whom he calls his better half. In his newly published book, Around Clymer, Rod returns to his roots in an effort to share the photographic history of Clymer, the small town in which he grew up years ago. And so with this impressive and heartwarming background, I am pleased to welcome Rod Beckerink with Greg Peterson for a delightful and locally relevant conversation.
Thank you, Maureen. Rod Beckerink, you kidding me? This is fantastic. And you know, I know you're one of the foremost tennis coaches in southwestern New York. I also know you're a good tennis player, and I just want to know, aside from you, who's the best known Dutch native tennis player?
Well, I guess I would have to say Tom Akker. Finished runner-up to Arthur Ashe at the 1968 U.S. Open. So he's kind of my idol as a tennis player with Dutch heritage. So.
Did your paths ever cross with his? Did you?
Not directly, but when I retired, my colleagues at Southwestern gave me a signed autograph photo of Tom Akker and a Tom Akker tennis racket, so it was quite appropriate.
So, obviously you're Dutch. You're a native of Clymer, New York. Beckerink gives it away. And tell me a little bit about your mom and dad.
Well, both sides of my family, 100% Dutch, as far as we know. Mom and dad, we had a dairy farm that I grew up on. My brother still operates it on 474, about 2 miles short of going to Clymer. Dad was a hard worker, led by example, if not by his words. You could tell what he was all about by just watching what he did. And my mom was more vocal. She was, I think, one of the first women in Chautauqua County to be on a school board. At least she was in Clymer. But we had a quiet family, not a lot of conversation, but we had a great experience. At least I had a great experience growing up on that dairy farm back in the 1960s and 70s.
Can you date your family back to when they came here from Holland?
Yeah, on my Beckerink side of the family, it goes back to the 1840s, and my mom's side of the family about the late 1860s. The family tree has been well established, and we can take it back to the Netherlands to the late 1400s, actually, with a couple lines of our family tree.
You're probably related to William of Orange?
Oh yeah, distant relative. Yeah, a lot of royalty in the family, yeah.
So did you get a sense that there was a migration in your study, like what drew the Dutch from A, leaving Europe, and B, kind of settling in an area which is not on a lake?
Well, the reasons why the Dutch left Winterswijk, the Netherlands, beginning in the 1840s, 1850s, was for the most part economic hardship. The wars and the revolution of 1848 in Europe created a lot of political turmoil. And if you weren't first in line to inherit the family farm, your best bet was probably to leave the country at that time. For some Dutch immigrants, there was some religious persecution, and many of them went to Holland, Michigan, and further west to Iowa. But from what I read and uncovered, most of those that settled in the Clymer area came for economic reasons, economic hardship in the Netherlands. And what brought them to the Netherlands, or to Clymer, I had heard and read, I don't know how much credibility to give to it, was that they just ran out of money going any further west, so they stopped in Clymer. What I did uncover in some research was that with the Holland Land Company and the Holland Purchase, which included almost all of western New York, that land agents looked to Dutch immigrants as loyal, hardworking, able to pay their bills. And one thing that I did read, George Washington Patterson, Patterson Library of Westfield, was referred to by some of the Dutch immigrants as being well-respected and lenient with some of the terms of their loans and the length of their loan before it was paid off.
So it was the Holland Land Company, the title is there, where I assume the source of the investments and the original owners were from Holland? Is that fair, safe to say?
The Holland Land Company was created as a investment syndicate in the late 1700s following the American Revolution. These Dutch investors had money to invest in the United States. And at the time, they could not own land until 1798. Following a number of deals and settlements and treaties with Connecticut and Massachusetts, boundaries were established in western New York, and what needed to be done was to have the land surveyed so it could be divided into lots and then sold off to potential buyers, which would have been done in the early 1800s as a connection to other names associated with Chautauqua County. Joseph Ellicott was hired by this syndicate out of Philadelphia, where they had their base. Came to Chautauqua County with 130 surveyors, and in 1801, 1802, I think they finished in late 1802, had divided up Chautauqua County into 6 by 6 mile township plots. And one of the agents also was Paul Bustye, from which we get Bustye, New York. They, tried to find the settlers to buy land in this area, and that would be done in the teens and in the early 20s.
So there was a town of Clymer created through this parceling up of the townships through the surveying of Joseph Ellicott, which is much bigger than it is now.
Yes.
So the surveyed Clymer is...
Clymer was created in 1821 by an act of the New York State Legislature when it was divided from the town of Chautauqua. And at the time of the division, the township of Clymer included Clymer, French Creek, Mina, and Sherman. By 1831, those other three townships had divided off, and what was left was just the current township of Clymer. What, in my ties to the Clymer Historical Society, we tried to, a few years ago, have a historical plaque placed in Clymer stating that Clymer was named for George Clymer, signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of only 6 individuals to do that. That was the legend that everybody in Clymer related to. But when we got our first response back from the company, the Pomeroy Foundation, I believe it was, we didn't have enough proof that it was named for Clymer. And the legend goes that in their first meeting, there were about 5 people gathered in a log cabin. They looked at the Declaration of Independence and they counted down a certain number, and it ended up George Clymer. Well, the legend is not reality, because when the legislature created Clymer, that was already a chosen name. So the first town meeting took place months after the township was actually created. More research showed that if there was any connection, it was lost in a fire in Albany that destroyed most colonial and early state records in 1903. So all of that was lost. My best conclusion is that because Joseph Ellicott and Paul Busti were originally from the Philadelphia area, and George Clymer was in the Philadelphia area, that he was chosen as the township's namesake.
Well, it was not uncommon at the time. Places like Gary
Sure.
and
Sherman.
Carroll and Ellery and Sherman are all kind of founding father
Exactly,
names.
exactly.
It's a logical step, but the person who actually decided it was probably somebody in Albany.
Right, and those records were destroyed and lost to history. So we'll have to look for some other rationale to make the connection between Clymer and the town itself.
Before the Dutch immigrated here seriously in the 1840s, 1850s, like your forefathers, what was here? What was the early 18 teens, 1820s Clymer like?
It was the wilderness, really. I mentioned that first town meeting was in a log cabin, and the early town founding fathers created in that first town meeting. Just to give you an idea, they put out bounties on wolves, and one of the early settlers was Peter Jaquins, and in the mid-1820s, I think there was a record that he had trapped 110 wolves in the area. So it was truly the wilderness, and anybody that came here had to really literally carve out from the trees a stake in their property. So it was truly wilderness.
So when there was this immigration of Dutch in the 1840s, a few years after it had been formed, was there a sense that, I don't want to say misery loves company, but it was this rough-hewn area, and it became kind of a community, a cultural.
Well, I think the first Dutch settlers that did come here, anything was probably better than what they left in Europe. The first few years might have been difficult, clearing the land, but they persevered, and by the mid-1800s, 1850s, there was a growing community, and a church was established on Clymer Hill by 59, I believe what the date was. So they got off to a slow start, but it's slow and steady progression.
What was the, if you could see the early years, other communities, it was maybe the advent of a railroad. It was an advent, if they're on the water, of just having transportation from point A to point B. Can you point to something that sort of put Clymer on a ascending arc?
I think aside from the first Dutch settlers that came in the 1840s, followed by relatives that came in the 1850s, the railroad connecting Corey, Pennsylvania, to Brockton, New York, and Chautauqua County ran through Clymer. And, that would have taken off right at following the Edwin Drake's discovery of oil in Titusville in 1859. So there was a connection of transportation and commerce from places further south beyond Corey, through Chautauqua County to Brockton, and then on to Buffalo and further east.
I noticed early on in your book, which I had an advance copy, you show pictures of tanneries. So was that part of the commerce? I mean, in order to sustain themselves, they had to have something.
The tanneries were, I think, one of the first industries. I think you would have found tanneries and sawmills all over the county. The tannery, which was located right in town, obviously took advantage of the wildlife in the area, the deer. I think by then probably the wolves had been eradicated for the most part, but
By that one guy.
yeah, I think so. But the livestock in the area would have provided the skins, the animals for tanning. And if you're aware of the tanning process, what the first farmers could do when they came here and started cutting down trees, they sold their ash to the tanneries as basically lye to aid in the tanning process. So that just gave them a little bit of money to get started from what they had, cutting down their trees, and they took advantage of the maple trees for syrup, sugar, and as they gradually cleared the land, they would plant their crops and raise their animals and eventually, move on to a dairy industry, which Clymer was known for much of the 20th century.
What's the land itself, Clymer, as I recall, there are some hills to go up to Corey, and there's Clymer Hill, but the land itself is pretty flat. Right?
The town of Clymer itself is, like you said, nestled kind of in a valley, a broad valley, probably 3 miles wide, 3 miles north to south. Gravel bottom, which was great for farming. And in the early years, that land was cleared, and that's where many of the first settlers, English settlers that came from eastern New York, would have established the town. When the first Dutch settlers came, they came and settled in the northern part of the township, in some of the land that wasn't as desirable because it was already taken in town. But throughout the 1800s, the Dutch would move into town as some of those English settlers would leave. Some of the town names take on the town street names take on those early settlers' names, like Brownell, and a couple others. But I think by the 1860s, 1870s, the town was thoroughly Dutch for the most part.
How did they react to the Civil War? I mean, you got the 1860s, and did it? Here you are in kind of the southwestern New York. not necessarily near any metropolitan areas.
Surprisingly, I think, as was true with most immigrant groups, whether it was the Irish or the Dutch, they saw military service as a way to prove their loyalty to the country. And in many cases, I would think, the people that would enlist, it was money for them. And from Clymer, there were over 100 individuals that served in the Civil War. And I included one Dutchman's photograph in the book itself.
And to go on to say over 100 men from Clymer served and 27 did not return. That's a pretty high percentage.
Well, I think what's also true that many soldiers would die from their wounds instead of on the battlefield. They die from sickness and in latter stages of their care, unfortunately.
Curious, during that early years of Clymer, the governance of it all. Was there a county supervisor system? Or were they just sort of independent township action?
Good question I have not really looked at. You had town supervisors. The town supervisor was in charge of that township, and the town supervisor's list for Clymer is well established. Going back to the 1820s, the first town meeting, they elected a supervisor. I cannot really tell you how county government would be tied into the towns, how that got started and how it evolved.
Yeah, just as again, it's a curiosity, only because you got these townships, they have their own little fiefdoms, if you will. The town supervisors, they probably got their own taxing system. And,
Sure.
And their own infrastructure and how they bond for it. It's probably just sort of local stuff.
Well, and I think that also explains why growing up in a small town, you had this sense of pride and loyalty in that small town, which in latter years, like even today, when you're talking about schools coming together to combine sports teams, or most of the kids don't have a problem with it, but the adults are. It's kind of an affront to their loyalty to their town. But and maybe that existed back in the 1800s. I'm not quite sure.
Early on in your book, you highlight probably Clymer's most famous individual, albeit he was there not for much time, but
Briefly.
but Horace Greeley. So for the camera, we know that our good friend Doug Neckers spent seemingly the last part of his life, dealing on that subject.
Right.
But what's your sense of Horace Greeley and the family in Clymer?
Well, Horace Greeley and his family came from New England. His parents came to the Clymer area in the late 1820s, early 1830s. Horace Greeley would visit as a teenager and a man in his 20s. I'd like to think that his visits were some kind of influence on him in latter years as editor of the New York Tribune. When I think the quote is that, "Go west, young man, you have your future in front of you." That his visits to his parents a couple times in the Clymer area maybe inspired that idea as he traveled west, although he would return to New York City.
I know Doug spent, maybe embellished or not, but he seemingly worked for the local newspaper for a short period of time.
He was in Erie. I know he came, the last time he visited his parents, he would move on to, I think, Erie, Pennsylvania, and work a short time with a newspaper there, and from there, I think he'd work his way back to New York City.
Have you identified at all I know his family, I think Doug tried to find the family homestead. It's probably
Yeah,
in
it's
Pennsylvania,
up
isn't it?
on the state line. It's actually just over the state line into Pennsylvania, but his parents had a mailing address of Clymer, and they are buried, and a few other relatives in the East Cemetery in Clymer. And there's still a few Greeley names in the Corey, Pennsylvania area.
Yeah, it is remarkable when you just look historically that there was a resident, not a native, but a resident from Chautauqua County who ran for president of the United States.
Yep, yes.
Yeah.
I know that's somewhat tied into the Jackson Center and the Grant Room, and how Grant ended up at the Jackson Center, and instead of going across the road to the Fenton home, and part of that was, I think, Greeley running for president in 1872.
Do you want to tease that out a little bit more?
I've gone about as far as I can, but I'm sure you could fill in a few more details of
All
that.
right, here it is, sports fan. Normally not my style to do this, but briefly, Grant actually had lunch here in 1875 on his way to
75,
Chicago. Hence
that's
the Grant Room at the Jackson Center, because there's no other connection. And the Kents who owned the property were asked to house, or to be the host for Grant on his way up Chautauqua Lake to Chautauqua Institution. That's all interesting, it's all fact. Now you wonder, why did that happen? Because as you pointed out, the person who, because Grant was Republican, one of the founders of the Republican Party was Reuben Fenton, who had the other mansion in town, across the street, who also was here, physically in town when all this happened, and he was purposely snubbed by Grant. You'd say, how can that be? How can the guy, a Republican, snub a Republican? Well, the evidence of that is in the Grant Room, and aside from reading about it, there was a Harper's Weekly, and I found it at a flea market in Cleveland, Ohio, and just traveling back from Cleveland and looking through all those Harpers, and there was a big front page.
So those cartoons were in those Harpers, right?
Exactly, 1872, 3 years before, and there was the Republican convention in Cincinnati, and there was a movement afoot not to renominate Grant for his second term. And there's placards and the cartoons, it's just simply
Right.
anybody but Grant, we support Greeley, and there's a caricature of a bewhiskered guy named Reuben Fenton, and it says Fenton. And so clearly Fenton had rode the horse to not renominate Grant in 1872, lost that game, and then Grant was reelected. Fast forward 3 years, Grant's coming into Fenton's hometown. You know, he's a United States senator, and he snubs him. It's the ultimate political snub, and it happened here in Jackson Center.
Regardless of what's happening today, you had stuff back then. Politics, yes.
Well, sorry, folks, that's just a total diversion. So Clymer in the 1860s, 70s, it goes to the second half of the 19th century. Do they have a sense of their own destiny as a group?
I don't think there was any definitive decision made other than we are, getting started with our lives, our farms, our businesses. And what I tried to do in the book, contemplating how should this be arranged, more than just, if you're familiar with Arcadia Publishing, they have a series called Images of America, towns all across America, photos taken of past time periods and whatnot. Rather just put them into a book, I tried to come up with a theme, a interweaving theme throughout the book that tried to tell that story. So I start out with early life, the early settlers, the formation of the town. I continued that with everyday life because there's a definite connection between the farms and the businesses. one without the other, you don't have a town, you don't have a community. I continued that with everyday life, or excuse me, community life, churches, schools, and other organizations. And it becomes very clear that, aside from, your making a living in this world, that there's another purpose, whether it's a religious life, civic organizations, and the town was filled with those. And the last chapter of the book I titled Celebrating Life, in many different ways, both individual and group achievements have certainly come in Clymer's direction. So I hopefully created that with the photographs as well, and I think that's what I want the reader to take away from the book itself.
Well, I did, and I learned so much about Clymer, and even though I've been here for 73 years, and that you really laid it out, and especially names. The names that you see when you're traveling, names you see just throughout Chautauqua County, but they often have an ink on it, or a Wasink, or a
It's a giveaway that somebody with that ending to their name probably has a Dutch origin, and if it's in this part of the country, the state, it might have a tie to Clymer, yes.
And certainly the Dutch connection, the Tulip Festival, stuff like that, is what I certainly, a younger person, you kind of knew the Clymers having their Tulip Festival, well worth going out. My mother and dad would throw me in the car. So tell me about how somebody had to decide that our Dutch heritage had to go up a notch.
Well, following World War II, and during World War II, I mean, the people of Clymer, and I guess it was more late 44 into 45, 46. Some Dutch families maintained their ties to the Netherlands, and at the end of the war, the Netherlands, you think of Germany being destroyed and people going through hardships there. People of the Netherlands faced famine and hardship 45, 46, and one of the efforts that the townsfolk of Clymer put together was a relief effort of goods, clothing, whatever could be sent to the Netherlands to help them out, because they were their relatives, distant or close, it didn't matter. In the early 1950s, getting back to your question, there was in the winter of 1952-53 an effort to celebrate that Dutch heritage. And it first started out with the idea of a Schoonmakentag, make clean day, which they undertook that spring of 1953, which would be the first Tulip Festival. Wasn't called the Tulip Festival, like I said, for the first year, 2 years, it was a Schoonmakentag. And then because the townsfolk put together and built 4 red windmills on the 4 corners of Clymer, the roads leading into Clymer, and started planting tulip beds. It's like, we'll just make this the Tulip Festival. And for the next 30 years, it would be celebrated annually until, I guess, 1976. It took a hiatus for a few years because it had grown in size in the 1970s. There were carnival rides, and it was a lot for a couple of people to handle. I know one year my mom was co-chair of the Tulip Festival, and it really was a lot to put together. You had busloads of individuals coming in from Cleveland, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and probably you were there as well, experiencing all of that. It was quite an event, but it was a lot for a small town to put together. And since it was revived in the 1980s, is celebrated every other year. And it will again take place in 2026.
Were you one of those kids out there with the broom?
I was out there with a broom. I had my wooden shoes. I had learned the clomping dancing as a third grader. We danced in the streets, cleaning the streets, and making way for the tulip candidates to come down the street. And in later years, I will admit that we filled our little water pistols and went around spraying everybody with with our water pistols, as good old teenagers do. But I was out there, yes.
Statute of limitations is run, right?
That's right.
I'll give you that
That's
much.
right.
I'll give you that much. And I think you had a picture in here, one of the parades, and I think it was called the Weenie Raft.
The Weenie Wagon, the
Yeah,
Lectors Brothers.
Lectors, yeah.
The Lectors Brothers Weenie Wagon was actually, the photograph is from the 1920s and 4th of July parades. Clymer loved a parade, whether it was a Memorial Day or a parade or a 4th of July parade. And I think I documented this in a few photographs that showed whether, like I said, the Weenie Wagon of Lectors Brothers, where Lectors Brothers is spelled out on the sidecar or the side of the truck in actual hot dogs. They're tacked onto the truck.
That's one of them. That's the early on. And then you went on to show another picture, and this is the one this is this one here.
Okay.
This is 1958, so this is prime time. And I'll read it. A humorous Lecter Brothers float from the 1958 Tulip Festival depicts the Weenie Raft at work processing hot dogs. In an assembly line manner, an unsuspecting dog disappears into a meat grinder and sausage comes out the other end, to the dismay of all the children in the parade crowd witnessing such a sleight of hand.
That was quite a story, and it took place. You can see that right taking place on the float itself. So a little bit of humor there, a little bit of Dutch humor, I would say.
Well, except for the kids who are crying, wondering what happened to Fido.
Their dog was okay.
Anyways, you spend time talking about the commerce, you spend time about the stores, and one of them is a legacy store, is Necker's Company.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about Necker's Company, which has been there seemingly forever?
If you've been to Clymer in the past few years, Necker's Company has been there at that location since Necker's established and bought that from a guy named Beach. But it's been there since 1911, 1912, I believe. Originally, it was just the furthest east store. Today, it encompasses what was Necker's Company, Lectors Brothers, the hardware store, and a barber shop. Really? So if you go there today, Necker's Company includes all of that, and it is really, a modern-day convenience store. You'll find a gift shop upstairs, your groceries downstairs, a meat market out in one section, and outdoor gear, footwear in another section. So it's really quite a place to get your Christmas shopping done.
Well, that, and across the street is the Dutch Village Restaurant.
The Dutch Village Restaurant is another icon, and it has been there for eight decades. Different owners, but if get a chance to go there, I know people I talk to, Jamestown area, all around the county, will go to the Clymer Smorgasbord. It's not smorgasbord, it's not really Dutch, it's Swedish, but it's known as one of the best smorgasbords around. You certainly will not leave there hungry. Mm-hmm. Great place for breakfast. Their cinnamon rolls are very large, enough for a family. But again, it's more than just a restaurant. It's a gift shop, and just again, an iconic place associated with Clymer.
For a long time, another staple was Maple Vale. And of course, they had the fire. They're kind of moving back into that area, aren't they?
Yeah, Maplevale got its start actually in French Creek in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s. It would expand. Its owner was also a Neckers, but not closely related to Doug Neckers. But it would expand, become quite large, and take over the one building. There was a fire, and there was also a collapse of the building because of heavy snow, which led to their moving facilities to Jamestown, Faulkner area. But they have certainly provided a lot of restaurants around, I guess, the tri-state area with whatever they need for restaurant supplies. I know Heil Trucking got started as one of about 5 dads. I mean, their dad was same age as my dad. There were about 5 or 6 local milk haulers. They had a small truck, the tank that went around to pick up the milk from the dairy farmers. But Heil Trucking expanded and is very large today. Facilities, I believe, in Fredonia, on the west side of Clymer, trucking all over the country, really.
One of the nice things that you've done is not only focus in on location and commerce and things that happen, but also individuals. Some names really stand out from the Clymer area. Garrett Tempest. I've heard that name forever, and could you elaborate a little bit about him?
Garrett Tempest will draw, I think, different reactions depending on who you're talking to. I know some people looked at him somewhat negatively. Most people had a very positive remarks on him, and my dad thought he did a lot of good for the town. He came here as an immigrant himself, as a straight from Holland, and in the early 1900s would become an inventor and an entrepreneur in many different ways. He invented a balancing bolster for wagons and threshers, which balanced them out evenly on unlevel ground. But what was amazing for Clymer was that it would have its own independent telephone company and electric company established by Tempest in the early 1800s. He had a generator at first behind what was the Baptist church, which he bought after the Baptists left town and sold their church. He had a generator in a shed behind the church, and he would, again, like I said, establish the first telephone company right in town, which remained independent until the 1950s. And the electric company existed in the 1930s until, I think, the Niagara Mohawk, what became Niagara Mohawk, bought him out. But he was one of the founders of, again, the state bank, Clymer Independent State Bank. Also, so he was a jack of all trades. He was a jeweler, and he owned a gas station. And at one time, again, a tie to Robert Jackson, Tempest was one of the litigants, I believe, in a case with Robert Jackson with the Catholic family, because the electric mill or power generating mill, which he moved from Clymer to the Brook and Straw Creek, he controlled the water. He built a dam to create electricity. Well, about a half mile up from the dam, Cavendish Brothers Lumber Company had a very large business that was basically dependent on what Tempest did with the water. If Tempest was running too much water out of the creek and the dam, Cavendish Brothers had no water to run their mill and move logs to the mill and then the lumber across the pond to the railroad track. So I believe, was it the 1920s that lawsuit took place, that Tempest, and I think the Cavendish Brothers probably sued Tempest, and you'll have to remind me what side Jackson was on.
Tempest. And
Okay.
we have the file here. If anybody's curious, they can come and look at the entire file that has been accumulated over time, the Tempests and the Cavendishes. And you cover that in the book, at least the dam itself, and how that did lead to litigation. You're kind enough not to spend any more time on that, but setting up, you did set up.
I just wanted to put the T's in there for somebody that wanted to
T,
research a little bit more.
Yeah, they can come here and talk about that. And also, Jackson was involved, and I'm not sure, with the bank. Doug would talk about that.
Okay.
Doug's dad or grandfather, I
His
forget.
grandfather was one of the early directors of the bank, yes.
At the same bank,
Yes.
and took a leadership role, and ultimately the bank had financial difficulties, as did every bank during the bank holiday time period, but ultimately Doug's grandfather did pay back all of the investors, and that's just
And
a
it-
source of pride of the. for the
Right,
Bank of Fairlawn.
and following the initial closure, I think they made good on all their loans, and they reopened quite quickly and reestablished the bank itself.
So there was, anyway, that's another part of the story of Clymer. Also, you talked about Phil Gravink,
Yep.
and that's a tremendous story. Could you talk about that?
Well, I grew up in Phil Gravink's kids I was friends with, and I did not know the story of Phil Gravink, other than he had a farm on the west side of town. Yet later in life, a little bit before I started putting the book together, realized how much this individual had meant, not just to Clymer, but what he had accomplished for the skiing industry as well. But Phil Gravink, Clymer boy, a very good athlete, would go to Cornell in the 1950s and get pulled onto the rowing team at Cornell and become the Cornell eights, I guess, 8-man rowing team would become 4-time NCAA champion and just missed out on going to the 1956 Olympics when maybe Yale beat them after Cornell had beat them earlier in the season. But that was his first claim to fame, but he left that behind and would come back to Clymer and take over the family farm. Well, he and a couple other gentlemen established a Peak and Peak ski area in the early 1960s. And Phil would later go on to become a very important figure in skiing throughout the country. He would move to the New England area and belong to a number of ski industry associations up there until his passing just a few years ago.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Phil when he was here, about an hour's worth. And I knew so little about him, but we found footage of the rowing.
Okay.
And it's all on YouTube, so if you want the Phil
Okay.
Gravink story. But that was a thrill for me, because you're talking to somebody I know so little about it. He was such a nice guy, such a gentle giant, but he was tremendously successful. As was another guy who was not a native, but he's certainly a product of Clymer, and J. Hugh Kalkrick.
Jehu was certainly, in recent years, as you mentioned, a product of Clymer. He would come here as a refugee from wars in Liberia. And his mom and he would be in Findlay Lake and starting out in the Clymer school system. He knew soccer, but he knew nothing about football. But by the time he finished ninth grade, and he was certainly a name to be reckoned with in high school football. In the next 4 years, would bring Clymer's name to many schools throughout the state because of football. You'd go on to Michigan State, play 5 years there, and would make it to the NFL, finally playing with the Buffalo Bills at the end of his career. He got in for a couple plays. Quite an accomplishment for a young kid from Clymer.
It's a remarkable story, and it's got a whole Jackson connection with the Blood Diamonds and ultimately the Sierra Leone Tribunal. And we
Yes.
had him here also early on, and I think helped him understand a little bit what happened to his dad, because that's the, kind of a, he was young when all that happened.
Sure.
And so,
I know my wife Marion had conversations with Jehu's
yeah,
mom because they're
Ah.
both Liberians. So, they were trying to figure out, what whose family, whose tribe they belong to, and my wife is Crew, and was she Crew or she's Crew also? So, anyways, but
well, for those that are really want to dig deep, you can see my interview with Marion Beckerink, my interview with Jehu and Phil Gravink. I've stumbled across Clymer here, and Doug Neckers, of course. We got many hours on Doug and his.
right.
He's he was very loyal to Clymer.
Yes, he was. And that's like, I don't know if you caught the initial quote at the beginning of the book, Dwight D. Eisenhower. I should know this by heart. Perhaps you can pull it up real quick there. That it's a privilege for an individual to have grown up in a small town, regardless of where they go. They will always carry with them their fondest memories. And I think that's true whether you grew up and stayed in Clymer, moved a little bit away from Clymer, perhaps like I did, or Doug Neckers had a distinguished career with Bowling Green in Ohio as a world-renowned chemist, and many others. I mean, his brother was a brilliant, or his uncle was at Southern Illinois University. I mean, Clymer has produced a lot of very well-known and maybe not so well-known professionals that have gone on to do great things throughout their careers. So,
Doug's brother Bruce was a president of the Michigan Bar Association, among
Right.
other things. And you could go on in great detail. One of the guys that I knew and then lost track of, but he came back here last year, was Don Beckerink.
Don.
And Don came back here. We did an interview about, where did you go, Don? You were a lawyer at one point, and then you sort of got into the agribusiness part of it, and incredibly successful down in Florida.
In Florida, yeah.
And doing science, and continues to be so, but now is a little bit older than me. But Don's another guy who, from this area, who-
Right.
with the right name.
Yeah, the INK names are not just that, but that had their origins in early, or their education in one of the smallest central schools in New York State, Clymer. It's just, I think I graduated in one of the largest graduating classes of, maybe we might have had 74 in the graduating class, and that was the tail end of the baby boom in the 70s. So they weren't any bigger, but the names and what they've accomplished later on in life is something to applaud.
You sort of conclude this terrific photogravure and narrative of Clymer, with sort of the last page dealing with a new chapter in Clymer's history began in the 1970 when members of the Amish community arrived in the area. Again, as in the past, hard-working entrepreneurial families reinvigorated the local economy as new small businesses and a couple of large ones popped up around the town. And the Amish contribution to the future Clymer is a certainty, and the next chapter of this book is yet to be written, and it is how you conclude this. Do you get a sense that this is I don't want to say you wrote about an era, I don't want to say the end of an era,
Right.
an era, which Dutch drove, and then it's become not, it's integrated. I mean, that's just a typical community. And now you've got the Amish community, which has sort of become very much populated.
There's certainly a transition that's taking place. I think I wrote this book, or was drawn back to Clymer about 5 years ago when the Historical Society asked 5 families to present a history of their farm that had been in the family for over 100 years. My brother didn't want to do it by himself, so I helped him out, and we did that, made the presentation, like I said, about 5 years ago. And I was drawn it back into Clymer and history and interest in genealogy, and I had heard some of these stories and seen some of these photos, but it did pull me back in. And what I wanted to accomplish in some ways was put together a photographic history of the 20th century. There was a printer in Clymer in the 1970s that put together a history of Clymer from a manuscript that was written in 1910, I believe it was. So we had a history of Clymer up until about World War I. And I put together a photographic history. I'd like to go back, if I have the time and the ambition, to put together a written history of the 20th century and put a lot more into some of the things we've just talked about with these names and events and developments of the 20th century. But there's no doubt that by the end of the 20th century, the makeup of the town itself was changing, and the numerous dairy farms that dotted the countryside were beginning to disappear. The barns were still there, but the farming wasn't taking place. And I think my brother mentioned recently that, in our neighborhood of Clymer, there were at least 16 dairy farms, of which there are only 2 now. But the Amish have started to come in. They've been coming in for almost 50 years now, starting in the late 1970s. Initially as farmers, but not so much anymore. They are businessmen. I think one of the wealthiest person in Clymer today is an Amish man. He owns Eastern States Metal. If you're, it's in North Clymer. If you're traveling 474 to Clymer, you'll go by it. And if you're in the building trades, virtually everything you need in building is there. There are, cabinet makers and carpenters, and you'll see the one-room schoolhouses. So the Amish have definitely made an impact. I think my brother also mentioned they make up over 50% of the population now of Clymer. So there's definitely a change that's taking place. Where it leads into the 21st century, like I said, that chapter of the book is yet to be written. There are some Amish that are interested in their history. We've had a couple speak to our historical society about their life, why they came to Clymer, how we know and don't know each other as Amish community and the English community. and it just leads to a better understanding between the two. I do remember one of the questions that they had is, do you like us? I said, of course we like you, and we do business with you, and that has always been the case. So regardless of your religious background, your values, where you're coming from, what's important to you, I think the common thread is still there, that it is a community, and they're learning how to respond to each other in this evolving community. But I think it's working in a very positive manner.
Is it lost on you, as a good Dutch person, that when your forefathers came in the 1840s, they were sort of the new kids on the block, probably not understood, they probably didn't speak English, and they were dealing with the natives who were been there since 1812.
Of course.
And so all of a sudden, 160 years later, it's,
Well, what's the old saying? What goes around comes around. I'm sure, whether it was the Dutch who came to Clymer, or the Irish who settled in Boston or wherever, every new immigrant group faces hardships, fair or unfair. That's what happens. And I certainly try to convey that to my kids as students, as a teacher, is that, all groups struggle to one degree or another for acceptance, to find their way to fit in. And certainly the Dutch did that. And they probably held on stubbornly to some of their traditions. The Dutch language was used in church on Clymer Hill until 1914. Sermons were given in Dutch. And that was long after a couple of generations had been here. Mm-hmm. It was just a way for them to hold on to their tradition, as were a couple of photographs in the book. I point out, it's like, these guys are still wearing their wooden shoes in 1915, just because of tradition, and that's who they are. So, what was our, where did we get started?
Well, it's just that turnabout fair play, but that's with the Dutch came in the 1840s, the Amish coming in the 1970s. It's
it's a learning process.
Exactly.
It's a learning process of getting to know each other and gaining acceptance, and I think unless you talk to the other group and you have this connection, an exchange of ideas, that you're not going to learn from each other.
Right.
And sometimes that's a little bit awkward to begin with, but you have to keep on trying.
Yeah. And I commend anybody to drive through Clymer to North Clymer and to see what that Eastern States.
Eastern States, yeah.
Holy cow!
It's quite a yard of rafters and like I said, all kinds of building supplies. I have not stopped there, but I know we need a project at the Historical Society. I'm wondering if I can somehow finagle a few donations from them to get our project started. But it starts with communication.
Well, I know the IDA did some financing of that and working with them, which there was a delight, but it's just different because they just grew up in a different set of
well, the bishop at one point said he was getting too big. His road frontage started out like 100 feet, and it got to 300 feet. And it got to about 400 feet, I guess the bishop said something, so you can't grow anymore. So what he did was he went away from the road. So he's gone to the back side, and on one side he built a two-room schoolhouse. But yeah, it is very interesting to drive around Clymer, and you will see there are probably more solar panels on Amish homes and businesses than you will have on non-Amish homes.
Yeah.
They take advantage of their technology to the degree that the bishop allows them to.
Right. The bishop is located where?
There are a couple in the Clymer area. So it's very different from, let's say, the Episcopal or Catholic bishop of Western New York or whatever. So their local bishop is in control of a very small group of people. I can't remember how many families there is a bishop, and they will call the shots. Now, the Amish of Clymer are probably some of the more progressive ones of the area, from what I've been told. They came from northeastern Ohio. Mm-hmm. And if you've been to northeastern Ohio, they're fairly progressive, like the Amish down around Lancaster, Pennsylvania. If you go to Cattaraugus County in Conowongo or Sugar Grove area, the Amish there are not progressive at all. So there's a difference, and each area will have a couple of bishops that, will basically call the shots of what is allowable and what's not allowable.
Which is more than a religious type bishop. So we use the term, I think it's something greater than we may conceive as a spiritual guide, a leader.
Right. I think they're trying to maintain some of their traditions, and at the same time, how do you make progress in our modern world?
Yeah.
And again, that can lead to, I wouldn't say some awkward conversations, but how exactly does a local non-Amish population work with the Amish population? Mm-hmm. And you have to understand, where they're coming from to make that happen.
I applaud the Historical Society for creating such venues to permit that. Are there spokespeople within the, I don't know.
Well, we have a Tuesday morning work group at the Historical Society, and there were a couple of mornings that a couple of Amish females came to observe what we're doing. An older woman in her 60s, 70s maybe, and a younger woman in her 30s or 40s that has also written a book on Amish life, and that's on sale in the Clymer area. But they were very interested in keeping records of their existence in Clymer. When they came here, whose family has intermarried or has weddings, and what exactly is their history. So anything that we can do to help them out, we've been glad to try. So
Well, it's part of your town culture there.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yep.
This has been utterly remarkable, Rob. I could go for a long period of time. But we at the Chautauqua Sports Hall of Fame were curious about one little nugget. And one little nugget is the fact that there was, in the 1950 perhaps, a speedway called the Clymer Speedway. I don't know if Randy Anderson or anybody's asked about it.
Randy showed me that, and you had sent a clip of a film that a gentleman said was in Clymer. I don't know if you'd asked Speed Wiggers if he remembered that at the time, or that it came up afterwards. Hardly anybody knows of it, and to the best that I could find out after you first mentioned it, or Randy mentioned it, was that it was located across from the Clymer Center Cemetery in the Little Red Schoolhouse, in that field area right to the north of the Little Red Schoolhouse. But I need to be reminded to ask a couple of people that maybe still have a memory of that from the early 1950s, I think it was.
Yeah,
I think it was only there for a summer or two at most. But Randy had planted that bug and asked me a year or so ago if I knew anything about that, and I had not known that, and he had that photograph, and it's like, nobody that I talked to at the Historical Society knew that, but there are a couple of guys that I need to talk to.
Yeah, Randy found one advertisement, it was in the paper,
Right.
Clymer Speedway. We do have this story from the one racer who drove back in the early 50s, Blinky Litzinger, great name. he'd seen the video, and we have a video.
Okay.
And it was.
He was the gentleman that told you,
Yeah.
say, hey, I was at Clymer Speedway.
Because I had posted it, Mystery Speedway. They're sent out to
Okay.
the world. Anybody know anything? And we showed it to Blinky. He goes, look, look. And we filmed him looking at it, and all of a sudden,
Right.
Clymer Speedway.
Clymer's like, I was trying to make out in the film there were some buildings in the background, but it was going by too quickly
Fast.
to really make out if those buildings I could recognize, but I have to take another look at it and see.
This could take you to a different level.
Oh, I know, but that's what we like doing.
Well, you've taken this whole thing to a different level, and I can't thank you enough. This is terrific, and we will post this on our
Well, thank you.
YouTube
Thank
site.
you for the invitation.
Well, and we should talk about the book. First of all, what is the book? And you should talk about how people can get it. Let's do a plug here.
Well, the book is not yet out. It's supposed to be released next week. I got an advance copy. It's around Clymer, Images of America. You've probably seen this book on other towns around the county. I think there are a few on Jamestown, trolleys and the steamships of Jamestown, and one on Chautauqua. So this is around Clymer. It's what we were talking about this evening. It should be available at your favorite local bookstore in Lakewood, at Chautauqua this summer. It will be available in Clymer at the Dutch Village and Necker's Company. And hopefully I will be speaking at a couple other events, perhaps the Fenton at some point in the future, where we can do a book signing as well, so, once they come in.
Well, I'm honored that you permitted us to be the first.
Well, yeah, I leave that to Greg. I mean, it starts out with Greg Peterson, and there's no better promoter of local history than Greg and the Jackson Center. And again, thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you. We should end on that because it's a high note.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.